Okay, we're going to look at how to achieve a big stopper effect with landscape imagery. We'll look at a purely in-camera method, as well as stacking several long exposures in post-production to accentuate the effect and make the exposure look much longer than it really was. Finally, we'll see if we can get a big stopper effect by stacking a set of regular exposure images with no blurred motion at all. Here's our shot setup then. A tripod is an absolute requirement for this. I'll set my focal point manually, then use manual focus to ensure the subject is as sharp as possible. Once the focus is nailed, I'll just take a test shot to make sure I'm happy with the camera's exposure metering, as I'm in aperture priority mode here. Now it's time to apply a neutral density filter, which is going to cut down light entering the lens and give us the long exposure times we're after. I'm using a fixed strength ND1000 filter here, which is rated at 10 stops of light reduction. Once we've got the filter in place, the viewfinder or screen naturally becomes very dark, so it's a good idea to focus and compose your image before putting the filter on. Next, I'll set my shooting mode to a 2-second timer. With the filter in place, the camera is suggesting a shutter speed of 1/1.3, so we'll see what that exposure comes out like. Okay, a little underexposed, so the ND filter has thrown the camera's metering off. Not a problem. All we need to do is increase the exposure compensation, which will lower the shutter speed further, and that's ideal for blurring motion. That's a 1.6 second exposure, and it's nearly there. We just need to increase the exposure compensation further. Let's try +2 stops. Bingo, that's our exposure sorted. So that means we can now increase the aperture and further decrease the shutter speed, safe in the knowledge that our image will be well exposed. I'm going to stop down to about f13, as that's going to give us a 60-second exposure. That should definitely be enough to blur the cloud detail and suggest some motion. There we go. The ND filter has given this image a rather cool color cast, so with some tweaking and further editing, we can transform the image into this result. Now let's do a series of long exposures with the aim of stacking them in post. To set up this shot, I'm setting a single focus point, then manually focusing to ensure the subject is sharp. I'm in aperture priority mode, and I'll take a test shot with the lens wide open. It's a little underexposed, so I'll knock the exposure compensation up to 1 stop and try again. Much better. Once we've composed, focused and exposed the shot, it's time to put the ND filter on. This time around, I'm going for an ND2000 filter. This one is rated at 11 stops of light reduction, so that should prove interesting. Right then, as we can see, that's reduced the shutter speed to 1/1.6. A quick test shot reveals the ND filter is throwing the camera's metering off. Therefore, we'll increase the exposure compensation to 1.7 stops and try again. That's better. So, with our exposure sorted, what we can do now is gradually stop down the aperture. Watch as the shutter speed becomes significantly lower. I'll settle on f14, giving me a 25-second exposure. Then I'll open the shooting mode menu on the camera. I'll switch to a 2-second timer, which is vital to reduce camera shake at the beginning of the exposure. Alright, so here's one exposure. We can see an exposure time of 25 seconds has achieved a motion blur to the cloud detail. At this point, it's a case of simply carrying on and firing off more shots, one after the other. It's a long process, basically. You may want to automate it with an intervalometer if you have one, or if your camera has that functionality built in. What you want to capture is the gradual movement across the sky of the clouds. Once we've captured several shots, I'm working with 10 here, we can then bring them into our image editing software and group them into a stack. I'll leave auto alignment on, as there may have been some slight camera shift between shots, and click OK. Once the stack is created, we can expand it to reveal the image layers it contains, and also change the stacking operator. It defaults to median here, but we'll find that mean gives the smoothest result. We can also experiment with other stacking operators for various effects, but to achieve the definitive blurring movement that we're after, we'll stick with mean. Finally, I'll jump through and isolate each image in turn, finding one where the light is most intense on the castle. I will then duplicate this and drag it out above the stack group, add a mask layer, invert the mask, then paint back in over the castle. This is an optional step, but I'm just doing it to get the best looking foreground scene possible. Here we are then, with one single exposure, and the mean stacked result for a stronger big stopper effect. Alright then, finally, let's examine creating the big stopper effect entirely in post. So we're going to do away with the ND filter and use regular shutter speeds to capture a scene. Now you can of course simply set up your composition and fire off shots manually, but I'm going to set up an intervalometer timer here, which I can do in camera. I'll stop down slightly to f5 and take a test shot, again in aperture priority mode here. It's underexposed, so I'll raise the exposure compensation to 1 stop and try again. That's more like it. Right, so now what I'll do is access the camera menu and find my way down to the shooting mode options, where we'll see interval shooting and time-lapse here. Pressing right on the D-pad grants me some options here. I'll leave number of frames at 30, as I can always cancel the interval shooting if I don't need that many. Start waiting time is the initial delay after pressing the shutter button, so we'll leave that at 2 seconds. Interval length is the time between each shot, so I'm going to raise this to 8 seconds, I reckon. Okay, that's everything configured, so I'll move back to the previous menu and commit the option with the OK button to ensure it's enabled. Moving back to my live view then, all that's left to do is press in the shutter button and our initial timer will begin. We can see at the top of the screen the number of shots remaining, and there will be an 8-second delay between each shot. And now it's just a waiting game. That 8-second interval between shots should give the cloud detail enough time to move, which means we should get a nice, smooth result when we finally stack the shots. Here we go then. Bringing the images into our image editor as a grouped stack allows us to switch between stacking operators and observe the results we get. Mean gives us the smoothest result. Median works well too, and we can experiment with other operators like maximum and minimum, but mean is the one we want to use. Let's look at a single exposure on its own, then a median stack, and finally a mean stack. And that's all for now. I hope it's been an interesting watch and has given you some ideas to go and try out. To get started, I would recommend a basic tripod and a strong ND filter, as this type of photography is typically done in daylight or sunset situations, and you need a strong filter to get the kind of slow shutter speeds that produce the blurred motion look. Finally, for the post-production, you need image editing software that can align and group images into a stack, like Affinity Photo. You can see the accompanying article and example images by following the link in the description. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out the other videos on my channel.